Hello guys, this is Coach B with masteryourchess.com, and this is the second part of the Rook Endgames video lesson 5 tactical elements. In these type of positions, when you have two passed pawns, if those passed pawns can reach the 6th rank without being attacked, then the black rook will not be able to prevent one of those pawns to promote. So after d6, black will not be able to prevent one of the pawns from promoting. Here, if the black rook will come to d2, attacking one of the pawns, that pawn can simply march forward. And if the rook comes to attack both pawns, the pawn on c6 and d7, well, the pawn on c6 will simply just march forward as well. And now, if black takes one of the pawns, the other pawn will promote with check and also win the rook, so that would not be the best move. And if black moves the rook to c6, well, the other pawn will promote and white will still win the game from here. And coming back from the beginning, after pawn to d6, king to f7 is not any better. After pawn to c7, let's say rook to c2, and we move the pawn to d7, black is still not going to be able to prevent white from promoting. After something like king to e7, then we're just going to promote the pawn on c-file. After rook takes, we're going to take the rook and promote again. If here, instead of king to e7, black takes one of the pawns on c7, we're simply just going to promote the other pawn and then win the game from here. And here's our next position. Here, the black rook is on the 8th rank, covering the promotion square, but even this doesn't help. After pawn to d6, the rook will not be able to prevent one of those pawns from promoting. After something like rook to d8, attacking one of the pawns, and we're simply going to push the other pawn to c7. And now any move that black will make here is not going to help. If he moves the rook to d7, going between the pawns, well, the other pawn will promote and pick up the rook as well. So that's definitely not the best option. If the rook will go to c8, trying to block that pawn from promoting, the other pawn will push forward, attacking the rook. And now if the rook takes one of the pawns, the other pawn will promote and also picking up the rook. And the last try, if black here just takes the pawn on d6, obviously again we promote the pawn on the c-file and win the game from here. And coming back from the beginning, after pawn to d6, just moving the king to f7 will not help either. Here we could push the pawn to d7, attacking the rook. After rook to d8, we're just going to move the other pawn to c7. And then black has two tries, none of them will succeed. If he moves the king to e7, then we're simply going to be able to promote the pawn on c8. You don't want to take the rook here, as black will be able to take the pawn and the other pawn. I mean, you're still winning, you have the other rook, but the game gets more complicated as black has two connected passed pawns on the side, and the king would be pretty close defending them. So you don't want to complicate things. Again, just promote the other pawn where the king cannot reach it. And then here black will have to either sacrifice the rook, or if he saves the rook, you're going to have a queen and rook versus rook, which is a lot easier to win. And then coming back, if instead of moving the king to e7, attacking the pawns, if the rook takes, again, we'll just promote the other pawn and win the game like that. And here's our next position. Here we just have one pawn on the 6th rank. But even one pawn on the 6th rank, if the rook is not able to access the 8th rank, you will always want to watch for those positions. Having the pawn on 6th rank, if you could cover the square behind it, you will be able to win the game. So the correct move here is rook to g3. A beautiful move. You're sacrificing the rook, and all that black has is to either take your rook, which after that you're just going to move the pawn to g7, and just because the rook does not have access to the 8th rank, you will be able to promote it on the next move. So after something like king to f4, you get the queen. Now you should win the game from here, but again, winning will not be easy, but definitely the odds are in your favor having the queen. Coming back from the beginning, after rook to g3, if black is trying to prevent that pawn from promoting with the rook, let's say rook to b2, pawn to g7, rook to b8, we're simply going to promote that pawn to a queen. And now if black sacrifices the rook, we're simply going to take back, and we should be able to win the game a lot easier, especially that the black king is stuck to the edge of the board. Here's another position, white to move, find the best move. And if you found the move b6, nice job. This is a beautiful move. Here black has to take the pawn. If he does not take the pawn, let's say he moves the king to d7 here, we're simply going to take, and we will be able to promote on the next move. Black will not be able to prevent that. After rook to a2, we're going to promote that pawn, and we will be able to win the game a lot easier. But coming back from the beginning, after b6 and a takes b6, we have a beautiful move, rook to a5, sacrificing our rook as the pawn is on the 6th rank. This will prevent black's rook from coming behind it. And from here, there's two tries that black has. If he's going to move the king to c8, coming towards the pawn, he's not going to reach there. Even though he reaches b7, we're going to promote the pawn to a queen, and the rook guards that pawn, so black will not be able to take the queen. We are going to be able to keep the rook and queen and win the game from here. Coming back after rook to a5, if black does take the rook here, b takes a5, we are going to be able to move the pawn to a7, and the black king is outside of the square of the pawn, and also the black rook will not be able to prevent it no more. And we will be able to move the pawn to a8, promote it, and also win the game from here. And here's our next play. Find the best move. And the correct play here is pawn to e6. Another great move, sacrificing the rook. Even though at first it might seem that black is in the square of the pawn, if he does take that rook, he's not going to be able to stop the other pawn, as we're going to take on f7, and now the pawn on f6 will prevent black from getting to the pawn on f7. So after something like king to d7, we're going to promote the pawn and then be able to win from here. And coming back from the beginning after e6, if black, instead of taking the rook, will take the pawn on e6, well, here we could even simply push the pawn to f7 right away. If he goes with rook b3 check, we are going to be able to move to f4. If he does take the rook after that, we are going to promote our pawn to a queen and then be able to win the game from here. And coming back, better play after he takes on e6 is to retreat the rook, let's say rook to d3, because black will not be able to prevent the pawn on f6 from promoting. The white king covers the square f2, so the black rook cannot come behind the pawn, and if black tries to move the rook to b1 to be able to check the king, if that pawn moves, the king will come to g2. After something like rook to b2, king to g3, rook to b1, we're going to be able to push the pawn on f7. After rook to f1, we are going to be able to bring the rook to f3, blocking the check, and now the black rook will take on f3, king will take on f3, and after king to d7, we're going to promote our pawn and win the game from here. And here's our next position, a little bit more challenging. White to play, find the best move. Okay, assuming that you thought about the position, the correct play here is rook to a8 check first. We want to move the black king away from the pawns on e5 and f6. So after king to h7, then we're going to push the pawn to e6. Here, if black does take the pawn, let's say f takes e6, we are going to be able to push the other pawn to f5. We're trying to get the two pawns next to each other on the 3rd rank. And if he does take the pawn, let's say pawn takes g5, now the black rook will not be able to come behind that pawn to prevent it from promoting. So after pawn to f7, king to g7, we're simply going to promote, as the rook is there to protect the queen. And coming back, if instead of taking the pawn here, black will play the rook to f4, well, we are going to be able to take on e6, and now if black takes one of the pawns, we are going to be able to move the other pawn to e7. Rook coming behind it, we are going to be able to promote it, and after the rook takes the queen, we take back, and we will be able to win with the rook. And coming back after rook to a8 check and king to h7, after we move the pawn to e6, we looked at the pawn on f7 taking on e6. If he, instead of taking, the rook will come to f4 right away, taking that pawn, then we're simply going to take on f7, and same scenario, after rook takes f6, we're going to be able to promote the pawn and win the game from here. In this next position, white is down 2 pawns and he's in a little bit of a mess. However, he's able to save himself. So pause the video and find the best continuation from here. Okay, if you found the move c6, nice job. This is an excellent move. After this move, black has only 2 options. If he does take the pawn on c6, we're simply going to be able to move the rook to b5. A rook sacrifice, as the pawn on b6 is on the 6th rank, and this will prevent black from coming with the rook behind that pawn. If he takes the pawn b5, we're simply going to push that pawn, and now black will not be able to prevent white from getting a queen. And coming back Here, if instead of taking the rook, black will move the king to d7, we're simply going to push the pawn to b7. If black moves the rook to a5, taking the pawn, here we got to be careful. We don't want to take the black rook, as the black king will be able to come next to the pawn, and then coming in front of the pawn will prevent that pawn from promoting. We should be able to still be able to win with the rook. However, if the game does get a little bit more complicated, here the best move is simply coming back with the rook to b3, for example. And now let's say black moves the rook to b5. After we take the rook and he takes back, we will be able to promote. Now black doesn't have a rook to fight with, and we should be able to easily win the game from here. Coming back from the beginning after pawn to c6, if instead of taking the pawn here, he's going to move the rook to c4, well, here we're just going to take on b7, and now black cannot access the 8th rank, which means we're going to be able to promote on the next move. And here's another challenging position, white to play, find the best continuation. Alright, and correct continuation here is rook to c6, sacrificing the rook. If he does take the rook here, then we are going to be able to move the pawn to b7. And now black will have to stop that pawn from promoting, moving the rook back to d8. We are going to be able to take now on c6, and now we've reached with 2 passed pawns 6th rank or above, and black is not going to be able to stop us from promoting. After something like a5, we're simply going to bring the other pawn to c7, and now we will be able to promote one of the pawns and easily win the game from here. Coming back after rook to c6, if black takes on c6, we are going to be able to take with the other pawn. Pawn takes, and we're going to move the other pawn. We will be able to promote and also easily win the game from here. But the best continuation after rook to c6 is rook to take on d5. With this move, black is able to get a draw at least. And then from here, after rook attacks on c7, let's say black moves to b5, we're going to take on b7. Let's say king to g7, king to g2. From here, the game should end up in a draw with the correct play. If you liked my video, please subscribe and don't forget to check out my new website, masteryourchess.com, where you can learn, practice, test, and master your chess knowledge.